Hello, this is Scottish Independence podcast number 97, and this time I spoke to Professor John Robertson, who in the time before the referendum had conducted an extensive study showing that the BBC and other media organisations were quite biased towards the no side of the debate, and I'm sure that won't come as a massive surprise to you. And then there were a number of disagreements with the BBC, accusations of bullying. They phoned his boss and demanded to know what was going on, but we talked about that in the last episode. This time I asked him about the barrage of Unionist propaganda in the final few days before the referendum, and I asked him about how we can improve the media situation in Scotland post-referendum. Should we be looking just to make our own media, or do we still have to keep the pressure on the BBC? This time it was actually recorded on the phone, so the way it sounds is a little bit different from what you're normally used to hearing on the show, but it's not bad. Hi, Professor John Robertson, how's it going?
It's going well, really. It's pretty hectic still. I didn't think things would die down, in the days after, but I'm getting interviewed non-stop by people desperate for someone to talk about it. In some cases, Radio Clyde only recently. It's quite impressive about Radio Clyde. They have a kind of political awareness that West Sound down in Ayr don't seem to have.
Well, I said Professor because you were also on Basque television. You just told me off air.
Yes, on a documentary on Basque television. People who have seen photographs of me will know that I'm not the stereotypical jock with red hair and the freckles, and they actually expressed disappointment when they saw me. They said, "Oh, you look more like a Basque than we do." They'd been hoping for I said I'd go and see you, Jimmy Bunnett, but they weren't much impressed by that. So very nice.
Were they just asking, or did they have a view themselves on how the whole thing played out here?
Well, clearly they're sympathetic. They were from a Basque language TV station, which is the national one in the Basque country. They have devolution of television in a way that we might want here with the BBC. They have a very high degree of that, so they were pro-Basque, but not necessarily very militant. And they were doing a big documentary. They had a team of 7 of them. They had somebody for every piece of equipment. I've never seen such staffing, and they just came down to here to talk to me They were here for about an hour or so, but there was only about 2 minutes of me on the documentary, and it's in Basque, so it looks like I can speak Basque in a very kind of stilted way with the dubbing.
So the last time we spoke was about the first research you'd done in the run-up to the referendum and how the BBC had consistently kind of favoured one side over the other. So the first thing I want to ask you is about the extraordinary barrage at the end of the campaign, that last week when it seemed like Yes was winning, and then just wall-to-wall coverage, pro-union, unbelievably so, uncritical reporting of the vow. What struck you most about that last week?
Well, it wouldn't be a surprise if I disagreed with you, because you've given me quite a feed there. It was astonishing. People, by that time, I had stopped really just being the researcher, and over the summer I started to campaign with the Yes Group. But the research I was doing, I'd published the first year of it in February, and then quite soon after that, Newsnet Scotland commissioned me to do a study of Good Morning Scotland, because they saw that as a real target. So I had to say I dropped the second year of that particular research project. Did the Good Morning Scotland one very thoroughly, I thought, with lots of interesting conclusions, and it got very little attention. I think people felt they'd heard the news with the previous one. After that, I came out, so to speak, as a Yes campaigner. I went to BBC Bias protests and spoke at them, and I joined the local group in Ayr and went out putting things through letterboxes. So when it came, I'd stopped doing that kind of study, except in that period you describe. I think it was the 11th September, when the 3 leaders came up. I'd been recording the news anyway, and I was watching it and thinking, this is astonishingly one-sided. So I thought I'll just do a quick one-day snapshot of that. And I posted it, and I sent it to Newsnet Scotland. I posted it in Newsnet, in Facebook and various places. But it didn't get much attention. I sent it to the Sunday Herald. They didn't publish it either, because I think the Sunday Herald, although they're apparently all in favour of independence, and they've had a massive increase in sales due to that, they hesitate also. I've had a wee exchange with Richard Walker, the editor there. They hesitate still to contradict the BBC, to criticise the BBC, even in the midst of that naked campaigning. I've forgotten the name of the English journalist who, Channel 4 economics editor, and used to be with Newsnight, Northern English guy. He said he was glad he'd left BBC behind, and he noted that in that week that you described in your question, in that week or two that they were in full propaganda mode, comparable to 2003 when they were largely campaigning for the nation's approval of the Iraq War. So quite dramatic. In the actual study of that one night, I found a 2-to-1 bias. I found the business of the conflation of the Yes campaign with Alex Salmond's personal views.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, absolutely astounding there. I'm just turning the pages. I've got it in my hands here to make sure I come up with the correct figure. I think it was 14 cases, yes, 14 times they referred to the Yes campaign, not by that name, but by the name Alex Salmond. Now, I think the No campaign know that Alex Salmond is divisive. He has massive support. He's the most popular political leader in Britain, but yet there's still a biggish minority who disapprove of him. And I think they continue to play to that, whether it's conscious or unconscious. It doesn't really matter to my mind. I think it's maybe a bit mixed, a bit of both. They largely hammered the Yes campaign by hitting it, into his face all the time, playing it to him, playing the man, not the ideas. I thought that was astonishing that one night. But the whole program, people in the local Ayr Yes campaign group, the following Monday, when we had a meeting up above a pub, as you do, we had the meeting. They were astonished by it and angry. Many were telling tales of having thrown their tellies out the window. I don't know if they had, but of wanting to throw their tellies out the window because it was so extreme. The other incident was the night of the Glasgow Square scuffles or riots, depending how you look at them, and the comparison of that with the egg throwing at Murphy. I thought when that happened, I'd been recording it, and I thought I'll do another one night look at that, and I'll compare the coverage of the Glasgow Square riots with the egg throwing.
With the George Square events, I happened to be in a pub just round the corner, and I went around to take a
Really?
look. And I went around to take a look, see what was going on, and the first person, strangely, that I ran into was Alex Thompson from Channel 4, who's right in the middle of George Square. And we said, "Hi, Alex, what's going on?" And he said it was basically some kind of right-wing thugs, Unionist thugs. The police sort of moved them along immediately. He actually said that the Scottish police are particularly good at this sort of thing compared to other places he's been around the world. But then I was astonished to see the next day in the newspapers, rival supporters clash. I never saw any of that at all. I'm sorry, I was there. I didn't see anything like that at all.
I mean, I'm sure that I did see one or two images of young Yes campaigners throwing things at cars, then striking back. But the ratio must have been of the order of 99 point something to 1 in terms of the violence against Yes campaigners and by people who, of course, again, the BBC wouldn't describe as No campaigners, despite the fact that we have pictures. I've in the little report I did, I have one or two pictures of people wearing Better Together badges, standing under a No Thanks poster, and offering Nazi salutes. It's quite clear. These people I accept are perhaps not the core of the No campaign or the Better Together campaign, but they can't be entirely separated from it. There's a continuum of UK nationalism, of unionism, which leads to these people, and there was the very easy association of the Yes campaign with one egg thrower, and the idea that this was the ugly face of the Yes campaign. The Daily Records wrote Labour MP Jim Murphy and cancer patient, and cancer patient hit by eggs. That kind of thing. So, as you mentioned earlier yourself, the suggestion that the George Square thing was somehow an even-handed scuffle, I think is clearly an attempt to allow the Better campaign to distance itself from the ugliness of its extreme wing, whereas the Yes campaign were unable to distance themselves, were not allowed by the BBC and others to distance themselves from a very small, ugly element of egg throwers. And, fascist charges and egg throwers are quite different, I think.
Absolutely. The thing is, you even had people like Andrew Marr. The last guest on the podcast was Colin Fox, and he pointed out that at a certain point in all the coverage, Andrew Marr said, "God forbid Scotland votes yes, but," and then delivered his question. I mean, this is crossing a line unbelievably. So what did you think of Salmond's comments after, that there's a difference between a public broadcaster and a state broadcaster, and the BBC has been a state broadcaster and not a public broadcaster?
Well, without wishing to sound too snobbish, as you mentioned, I am il professore. I instantly understood the point it was making. I thought it was somewhat academic a point to make for television at that time, and I think maybe I'm being unfair to him. It was a clear criticism, and anyone who understands those terms fully will understand he was suggesting, something quite negative about the BBC. But he didn't go near the words like bias or unfairness or whatever. He offered this rather subtle comment. Now, I remember also John Swinney on one of these panel shows being asked directly if the BBC was unfair and not being prepared to answer it. The SNP are clearly playing a game of some kind here, which I'm not fit to criticise particularly if they think it's going to work. But they're holding back from attacking the BBC. Even now, they hold back from attacking the BBC, and I guess it's strategic. They think there are still votes to be lost by attacking the nation's favourite broadcaster, Beeb, and all of the non-political shows that everyone loves. I can see the point in that, and I guess that's what they're doing, holding back. I thought it was a well-made point, but it would have been a well-made point in a lecture theatre here, rather than one in front of television.
What do you think personally? Since the vote, I've noticed that there's two main themes running from people who voted yes and other people who now regret voting no, but there's two kind of main veins of anger. One is directed towards the Scottish Labour Party, or the Labour Party in Scotland. It's a point whether there actually is a Scottish Labour Party, and the other is directed towards the BBC and the mainstream media. And with the media side of it, there seems to be two kind of strategies that we could adopt. One of them is what you're suggesting. The SNP think that it's better sort of softly, and the other is we need to start creating our own media. So do you feel that we should still be pressuring the BBC to try for a fairness that may never come, or we should just ignore them completely and start to try and create our own media?
Well, I have no doubt that it's necessary for new independent media to emerge, and I find it tremendously optimistic what I'm seeing online with various groups who are really just websites at the beginning, moving into broadcasting, and I think that's just tremendous. It will be important in the medium term that these organisations don't remain entirely private, that they have elected boards which represent their audiences and are accountable in the way that the BBC is not. So I think good that these are happening, but we'll have to watch they don't become just too much kind of little mini dictatorships of their own. But I think at the same time we still need to move to maybe clip the wings of the BBC. Thousands of people, maybe not enough, have signed up for the devolution of the BBC, that the BBC becomes answerable, in the full sense of the word, becomes answerable to Holyrood, presumably to the Education and Culture Committee, which, as you know from previous events, it isn't really answerable to. It goes along, sends the top brass along, and they answer some questions and they refuse to answer others. I think the devolution of BBC, that's going to meet massive opposition, but I think that should be part of the campaign, and I think that's something the SNP can do. I don't think they can do the other more direct attacks on the BBC that the independent agencies can do, but I think that would be a useful thing.
And in the post-referendum environment as well, one thing that struck me is, you might have thought that after they got the result that they were clearly campaigning for, there might have been some kind of truce, or at least calming down of the Unionist propaganda, but it seems to still be going full pelt.
I'd agree. There's no sign of a return to, say, 2 years ago, before the campaign. There's no sign of that. I read that as a sign of continuing anxiety, and the fact that they were maybe they were slightly surprised to have won. Some especially in the media, were maybe fearing worse, and maybe they feel they still have to finish it off properly. I'm reminded, as I said to you earlier, of Ian Davidson. Ian Davidson using the term that all would remain was bayoneting the wounded, and maybe that's what is happening just now. There's an attempt to kill off any residue of the yes support. I mean, completely hopelessly, of course, judging by the protests and by the online activity, which looks to me undiminished or undimmed. My impression is that this thing is not being put back in the box. To use the cliche that's been used a great deal, that the yes movement is there now.
What do you think of the extraordinary explosion in membership applications to pro-independence parties since?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that is quite remarkable, and the idea that the SNP may become the biggest political party